This is John Burke. John is going to speak to us about our earliest indigenous people ancestors, people who lived in this area long before we got here. His interest dates back to being in the Order of the Arrow as an Eagle Scout. He's the treasurer of Medina County. He is clearly a man who knows how to dress to keep track of the beads and the wampum that gets handed over to the people down there. In 2001, John portrayed the Lakota Sioux war chief, Crow King, in the 125th reenactment of Custer's last stand at the Little Bighorn in Montana. In 2009, he participated in the 250th anniversary of the siege of Fort Niagara with 3,500 British, French, and Indian reenactors. And in 2012, he was at the 200th anniversary reenactment of the siege of Fort Meigs. There are two parts to our program. First, Captain Wolfe of the Delaware will come to speak with us about his life and time. And in the second part, John Burke will step out of character and tell us about the woodland Indians and answer questions. Now, let us prepare our minds to go back to a different era. It's after the War of 1812, and the last of the Delaware Indians are preparing to leave their homes in this area and move farther west away from white settlers in Ohio country. If you are ready, let us now hear the words of Captain Wolfe.
Listen, brothers and sisters. In the past that is now lost forever, there was a time when the land was sacred, and the ancient ones were one with it. A time when only the red children of the Great Spirit were here to light their fires. A time when a warrior could hunt and eat as much as he needed and walk from horizon to horizon without ever seeing another human being. It was in this time of simple ways that we knew in our hearts the conflict that was to come. And whether for good or bad, we knew only one thing certain: there would be much change to our way of life. I'm a Delaware Indian. We call ourselves Lenape. It means the original people, because long ago we lived far from this Ohio country along the great water you call the Atlantic. And then the Chamonix came, and they pushed us west and further west until we came to this Ohio country. It was my grandfather who first lived in the Ohio country. And it was in the year of 1755 that he joined with many of his Lenape brothers and other tribes, the Miami, the Shawnee, the Kickapoo, the Ottawa, all gathered together to go to a place called Fort Duquesne in the town you now call Pittsburgh, where the three rivers meet. Here they would join the French and fight the British in the French and Indian War. It was on a warm summer day, much like today, that they met in battle. General Braddock, the British general, had come through the forest with 2,400 redcoats. There were no paths or roads at that time, and so he had to take men and cut down the trees and make a path for his army to come through the forest. But on this day, they came to a meadow, no trees. They walked into the middle, marched four abreast in columns. It was at this point that the French and their Indian allies fired upon the British when they were in the open. My grandfather said they would have killed all of them that day except for the bravery of one young colonel. You see, this colonel who fought alongside of General Braddock, he was in charge of the militia. The Indians thought he had the Great Spirit on his side because 3 times the horses were shot out from under him, and 5 bullets went through his clothing, and yet he was never wounded. You may recognize the name of this young colonel who formed the rear guard so the British could get away that day, for his name was George Washington. Now, there were many prisoners taken, and a group of Delaware, Cayuga and Seneca took a group of prisoners, and they marched them on a long journey west. They came south of here to go to the Maumee River and turn north and go to the fort called Detroit. Here they would sell the prisoners back to the British, and with the money they would receive, they would buy flintlock guns, powder, and lead. On this journey, they decided they would not sell one man back. His name was Jim Smith, and he was 17 years old. He had been one of the men who carried an axe and cut down the timber to make the road for Braddock. So when they came to Fort Detroit, they sold the other prisoners, and they took this young man and they adopted him. And they made him an Indian. They dressed him in clothing, bore his nose and ears, and gave him earrings and a nose ring. They called him Sawoya. On the return visit, they came again through this area here. You see his adopted Delaware brother, Tantolega. His wife was a Wyandot, and there was a large Wyandot village on Pipes Creek. You see, they went to there and were fed. They ate venison, which they dipped in bear grease and maple syrup. Oh, it is very good. They went from there east along the water, the south side of the lake called Erie. They built their birch canoes and traveled until they came to the Black River. Here they went up the tributary until the falls near the town you now call Elyria. Here they could fish and hunt as much as they needed. Here also were the wild horses. You see, they learned how to do this from skilled horsemen who captured these wild horses. They would take the best marksman and they would shoot the horse, grazing it just in the neck. So it would stun the horse and the horse would drop to the ground. Quickly then they would come and hobble the legs, tie the legs together to capture the horse. They hunted here for some time, and then they moved again on the canoes through the water east. And then they came to another river called the east tributary of the Rocky River. Here they went up the tributary until they came to a place called Panther Cave. They called it Panther Cave because of the many mountain lions and bobcat that lived at the cave. You see, these were the skins the Erie Indians used for clothing. Yes, the little one the lake is named after. Erie means cat. They took the skins of the cat and wore them for clothes. So they hunted the bobcat and the mountain lion. They hunted deer and bear. Here they also hunted much the raccoon. Oh, there were many raccoon then. A good trapper could trap 1,000 raccoon in a year. Do you have many raccoon now? Oh, you do. But you see, we eat this much like the venison. We roast it first. We stuff it like you stuff your turkey at Thanksgiving, and then we roast it and we cut it up, and before we eat it, we again put in the maple syrup with the raccoon fat. Oh, it is very good. You must try. The French lost that war, and with it they told the tribes, many who had sided with them, that now that the British owned all the land. We could not understand this because we thought the Great Spirit had given the land for all to use and hunt upon. There were many that did not want to stop the war, even though the French had decided to do this. One was the Ottawa leader, Pontiac, a great chief who came from the Cuyahoga River where he was born. He joined many of the tribes in a large confederation. You see, Ottawa means trade. The Ottawa tribe were the great traders. They lived in this area here and among the islands. He joined this large confederation of tribes together, and then in the same time, they sent the men out from many tribes to the 14 forts in the Midwest. They attacked all the forts at the same time. And many they captured, and many scalps were taken and prisoners. But there were 3 forts that could not be taken. One was Fort Niagara, the large stone fort at the mouth of the Niagara River and the Ontario Lake. The other was Fort Pitt, the old Fort Duquesne, where the 3 rivers come together. And the third fort was Fort Detroit. This one, the great chief, Pontiac, went to himself and lay siege for many months. Finally, there was a group of British that came from Fort Niagara under Colonel Bradstreet. He brought with him 2,300 men to reinforce the fort, many supplies. He put these on 60 long flat boats, the French called bateaux. These came to Fort Detroit, and once they were able to connect with the soldiers there, the siege was ended. I remember on the return visit, this Colonel Bradstreet took 1,200 of the men. He left 1,000 with the fort. He took 1,200 men to go back to Fort Niagara, and he followed along the south side of the Lake Erie. As he did this, they had to put into shore. This was close to the place, the mouth of the Rocky River. He anchored his boats just outside the mouth of the river, for it was dark. That night, a large storm came in off the lake. It destroyed 27 of his boats. The supplies and the furs he had were scattered along the shore. Many of my tribe and others that were in the area came and took many of the supplies. He eventually made it back to the fort called Niagara. After this, there was no peace in the Ohio country. The Lord Dunmore War in 1774, this Lord Dunmore was governor of the colony called Virginia. He sent 1,400 men to fight along the Ohio. And there was a large battle that year on the river called Point Pleasant. Here they met in battle with Chief Cornstalk of the Shawnee, and he also, much like Pontiac, gathered many of the tribes together. But after 2 days of fighting, Lord Dunmore's men, under Colonel Lewis, they had lost 200 men. The Indians had lost 46. But at the end of the second day, we were not able to retrieve those bodies, and so left the field. Thus, Lord Dunmore said it was a victory for the whites. This went on for several years, but it was soon after this that we heard that the 13 Fires, or colonies as you call them, decided to break their alliance with Mother England. We did not want to fight in that war. In that war, the Americans and the British both came to many of the tribes and asked them to ally with us. We did not want to do that. In 1779, at Fort Pitt, they had sent a general called McIntosh. He was sent by George Washington, yes, the man that fought with Braddock. Now he was in charge as a general of all the armies of the Americans. This McIntosh understood the Indians, for he had married an Indian and took an Indian for a wife. He came and asked a council of all the tribes, but only the Delaware came. We were represented by our 3 chiefs of the 3 clans, the Turkey, the Beaver, and the Wolf clan. Captain Pipe was always a friend of the British. He did not want to fight with the Americans. It was Chief Leatherneck and Chief Leatherneck, and also another chief, I cannot remember his name. He was not of my clan. They argued about who they would side with. White Eyes, that is the man. Ah, yes, White Eyes. But White Eyes and Leatherneck decided that they would fight with the Americans, and so they signed a treaty. It was the first treaty that was made by the Americans with any Indian tribe. And what this treaty agreed to was that the Delaware did not have to fight with the Americans, but they did have to allow the Americans to build a fort in the Ohio country, the first fort that the Americans had in this area. They did this at a large ford in the river, the Tuscarawas River, near the town you now call Bolivar. Here they erected a fort, and McIntosh, it was named Fort Lawrence. McIntosh named it for the president of the Continental Congress at the time. This fort did not stand for long, maybe 12 moons. And then the British came with Wyandots as their allies. It was led by Simon Girty. This man was a white man who had been taken as a young man prisoner by the Seneca and had lived with them. He learned their ways, and then he led them and the Wyandots with the British. Fort Lawrence soon was burnt to the ground. That was the only fort in the Revolutionary War that the Americans had. You see, George Washington wanted to use it to supply men to go and attack Fort Detroit, but this did not happen. Also during that war, there were 2 missions of the Jesuits, Ganotgahutton, Schoenbrunn. Here, many of our own Delaware went to be Christianized by the Black Robes. But in 1782, there was a group of militia that came from the Pennsylvania colony. They came to these 2 missions, and they killed 64 adult men and women and 34 children. This angered many of the tribes. This made most of the tribes side with the British for the remainder of the war. The survivors of those two missions, Ganakatut and Schoenbrunn, left the area. And they first went to another place. They built another town called Pilgrim's Rest on the Cuyahoga River. And then several years after that, they moved to the area here, near your town you now call Milan. Here they made another town, but soon left there also and went to Canada. The Revolutionary War ended much like the French and Indian. Most of the tribes had joined with the British by the end of the war. And when they gave up their land and now the Americans said they owned the land, once again, we were not represented at this treaty. None of the tribes, none of the chiefs. We did not agree that the Americans should have all the land again. I remember they sent an army against us in 1790, General Hamar, with 1,200 men. We ambushed him at night, took many prisoners and scalps. They went back to their fort called Washington, in the town you now call Cincinnati. Here they made another army the next year. This was led by General St. Clair. They had even more soldiers, 2,300. They marched north, and once again the Indians joined many of the tribes together, this time under the Shawnee chief, war chief, Blue Jacket, and Little Turtle, the great Miami chief. Once again we ambushed him at night. They call it the night of 1,000 slain, because that is how many we killed and wounded. Many prisoners were taken. After this, the Americans did not bother us. But then in 1794, they took another general who had been a general in the Revolutionary War. He came to Fort Washington and he built another army, even larger. His name was General Anthony Wayne. They called him Mad Anthony Wayne. We do not know why. We called him the general who never sleeps, because we could never ambush him and his army at night. You see, every night he built a fortification around his men in a square. He protected them, and we could not attack him. As he moved north, he built more forts, Fort Defiance, several forts to supply his army. When he came to a place called Fallen Timbers, here is where the battle ensued. The Indians lost that battle, and with it, General Wayne said, "Within 12 moons you must come to a place called Greenville. Here, all the chiefs of all the tribes must meet, or I will come back with another army. You must sign the talking papers." This we did. All the chiefs of all the tribes met at Greenville. They signed the talking papers, and these made the boundaries of the Indian territory very small. They said now the Indians must live in an area bordered by the Cuyahoga River down to the Tuscaroras near the town you call Akron, and west to the Indiana Territory. This northwest corner of the Ohio country was to be for the Indians. As long as the grass grew and the sky was blue, this is what was said in the talking papers. And yet, it was not long before the white settlers came and built their cabins and forts in this area also. It was in the year of 1805 that they had another council called of the tribes. The Seneca came, the Wyandots, the Delaware, the Miami, the Ottawa. Other tribes did not come, but these 5 in that year ceded much of the land here to the Americans. They brought $20,000 in gifts, and they promised an annuity of $9,500 a year for each tribe. None of the money was ever seen by any of the chiefs. But the land now included all of the area called the Western Reserve. It came to this area here. This was the western boundary now belonging to the Americans. This was known as the Firelands. You see, the state of Connecticut had said they owned this land. There was one man that owned much of it. I think his name was Edwards. But this was the Indians' land. They said they were giving it to their war veterans from the Revolutionary War. This was for damages that were done to their families and houses that were burnt during the war. And so they were giving them Indian land. We did not agree with this. The Firelands were included in this Western Reserve. These disputes are what led to the War of 1812. This is the war I fought in and earned my captain rank. You see, in that war, many of my Lenape brothers fought with the Americans, and others fought with the British. There were other tribes that did join both sides. In 1811, Tecumseh, the great Shawnee leader, had been on a long journey across the country to talk with all the tribes. He told them they must return to the ways of old. We should not depend on the white man trade. He told them we should all join together, all the Indian tribes, to push the whites back to the Appalachian Mountains. And he told everyone he spoke to watch first for the sign of the sun going away, the earth becoming black. After this sign, he said, watch for the earth to shake, and all the mountains shake, and the rivers run backward. And after these two signs, he gave each tribe a group of red sticks. He said, with each moon of the year, remove one stick from the bundle. And when you come to your last stick, and that moon ends, that is when you send your warriors to my village, the Prophet Town, in the Indiana Territory. The tribes listened. Many believed that together we could fight and get our land back. But in 1811, a general called William Henry Harrison raised an army, and he went to Prophet's Town. Here, Tecumseh had not come back from his travels. Only his brother, the prophet, was there. And the prophet said he had a vision that said, should there be a battle with General Harrison and the Americans, all the Indians would be protected. Their guns would not hurt them. Their lead bullets would not penetrate their bodies. This proved not to be true. And so many Indians died at Prophet Town, and Harrison won the battle and burnt the village to the ground. This is what Tecumseh came back to. But he did not stop. He again rallied the Indians. The next year, when the war was declared with the Americans and the British, I and many of my Lenape brothers went to fight with the Americans. I fought under General William Henry Harrison in that war. I earned my captain rank as a scout for him. And for that, I received a medal with his image on it as general. I remember also in that war, this is the medal. He gave this to me. He later became the Great White Father, or President of the United States, as you call them. In that war, that year of 1812, the British and their Indian allies came here, and they first attacked the settlement of Castalia. You see, here were many French squatters. They were living on the land that belonged to this man called Edwards. But they had many farms and fields of wheat. So the British attacked, and they burnt all their crops. And they took women and children prisoner and killed most of the men. Other settlements were attacked. Many fled to the blockhouse built in Milan. Here they felt protection. It was also in that year that General Harrison came with soldiers, and he garrisoned this island of Catawba. This is where I came to join the American Army. When I came here, I noticed many things. I passed areas where the ancient ones had built mounds. There were 3 burial mounds in the town of Milan. Also 3 in the town or village called Fremont, where Fort Stevenson was built. Here, when I came, this was an island. Portage River came to the West Harbor and emptied into this. And for many years, this had been a place of trade. The Indians had used their canoes, and they had put them in the bay to protect them against storms. All the trade routes had come through this area near the settlement of Norwalk. The Great Lake Trail came along the shores of Lake Erie. I notice now you have them numbered with numbers of 2 and 6. I do not know what that means. Also, the Great Watershed Trail came along where you have signs with numbers of 20 and 250. The other sign I see with the number of 61 on it, this also was a great game trail and trade trail, all centered in this area. So it was important for the British and the Americans to take control of this. To do this, General Harrison built in 1813, he completed by February of that year, Fort Meigs. This was to counter the British with their Fort Malden upriver. He also reinforced the fort called Stevenson. And by that summer, the British had come to lay siege on Fort Meigs. Fort Detroit had already been taken by the British. I remember one general called General Smith who came from the fort called Pitt. He brought with him an army. He was going to go to the Maumee River to turn north to fight it and take Fort Malden from the British. He built a road much like Braddock years before, through the forest. This was along the Watershed Trail, or the Great Trail, which was the route I mentioned, the Route 20 and 250. He made it wider for his wagons because he was moving 6 brass cannon. While he built this road, he was afraid of being attacked by the British and the Indians, who he had heard from his scouts that they had landed in Huron and were traveling south. He was afraid of being attacked, so he buried his cannon deep in the ground and covered them over. And he never came back for them. To this day, no one has found them, I think. But they must be along the road he built. But these were not good scouts, not like me and my Lenape brothers. They told him wrong. These were not British and Indians who landed at Huron. Oh no, these were the prisoners of General Hull from Detroit. You see, Tecumseh and the general called Brock, they had played a big trick on the Americans there. The Americans had Fort Detroit, and they had 2,000 men with cannon inside the fort. The British had brought 400 regulars, and there were 800 Indians. But what Tecumseh and Brock did was they dressed all the warriors in their finest war paint, and they marched them out in front of the fort, just outside of the gun range. And they marched them in front of the fort and back into the forest and around a big hill. And then the group joined the end of the line. And they kept going around, and the scouts in the fort kept counting them. They thought we had 5,000. General Hull, he surrendered without firing one shot. I understand later he was court-martialed for that, as he should be. These were the prisoners that landed in Huron for exchange. But also, very soon after that, this General Brock, who was a great strategist with Tecumseh, he was killed at the battle along Niagara River at Queenstown on the Heights. The general who replaced him was General Prock. And General Proctor was not a strategist like Brock. He was the one that lay siege on Meigs, Fort Meigs. This did not take the fort. He could not take the fort. And so he came back in July of 1813, and he lay siege on it again. But General Harrison fought well. And so the British retreated. But they thought they would take at least one fort. And then they decided, with their 4,000 men, they would attack Fort Stephenson in the town you now call Fremont. Here they went in a major called Croghan. He was there with 160 men. General Harrison asked if the scouts would go and give him a message to abandon the fort. He knew he could not hold out against 4,000 British and Indian allies. The scout that went was a man named Peter Navarre. He got the message to Major Croghan. And Major Croghan, after reading it, said, "We will stand and fight and keep this fort." He returned with that message to General Harrison. And that is what happened. This Major Croghan was able to fight off 4,000 British. They had 2 small cannon, but they were ineffective against the fort. And so they retreated finally back to the north side of the lake. It was soon after this, in October, that once again General Harrison needed the scouts to relay messages, this time to Commodore Perry. Commodore Perry sent a message by scout to General Harrison and said he needed more men for the upcoming battle against the British fleet in Lake Erie. So General Harrison sent 70 men. They were all from Kentucky, and they were all marksmen. They were not sailors, but they could shoot very good. This was important, to shoot the officers on the British ships. Then, in September. It was the 9th, one day before the battle. Again, there was an exchange of messages. And Harrison told Commodore Perry, "You must fight the British. They are coming. They have 9 ships." And Commodore Perry came out from the islands and took battle. I saw this battle. I was on the high point that overlooked the Lake Erie battle. This is where Harrison stood and watched Perry beat the British fleet, which no one thought could be done. Once the British fleet was defeated, this gave the American Army control of the entire lake, and we could maneuver and send ships and supplies and soldiers throughout the area. More soldiers collected, and General Harrison then went up the river to the north side of the lake, and there was the battle called the Battle of the Thames on the Thames River. Here he defeated General Proctor, and it was here that the great leader of the Confederation of Indians that fought with the British, Tecumseh, was killed. After Tecumseh died at the battle, his war cry and his commands not heard anymore. All the Indians from all the tribes he had collected at the battle faded into the woods. They went back to their villages and did not return to the war. After the war ended, I went back to my village. My village was on a lake called Chippewa, near the town you now call Medina. Here I lived in 14 wigwams. You see, in the summer we had wigwams. They were about 8-10 feet wide and about so high. You built them with willow sticks. They were easy to bend and tie together, and the ends we stuck in the ground, and over this we would put bark or reed mats. They were easy to make, and we used these for our hunting camps. We had 14 such wigwams that summer, and I shared those with the Wyandots. We hunted bear and deer. We hunted the raccoon there, and we fished in the lake, and we trapped beaver and otter. You see, these were the skins that brought most money at the trading post. The beaver they took, and the white men made hats from the beaver. They sent many of these east, and even across the great water, the Atlantic. I must think the whites have very few hats, because we sent them many skins. We hunted buffalo, yes, here in the woods. The buffalo would come each year following the same game trails. They would come nose to tail, following one another. Then the trees were much larger than the trees I see you have today, 150 to 200 feet tall. The canopy so thick, sunlight did not come through. The buffalo would come along these paths, and we would hunt them. These were fine winter robes, and the trading posts wanted these too. We would take the buffalo and also sew them with the fur inside for winter moccasins that kept our feet warm. These were much sought after. When the white men came, they found these buffalo trails. The buffalo had, with their sharp hooves over many years, dug deep paths. Sometimes the banks on the side were 6 to 8 feet tall. They widened them, put their wagons on them. And many of them are roads you have today. The game trails and trade trails I told you of, these were often buffalo trails. They came to this area here called the Black Swamp because it was the only area that was not covered with large trees. They could eat the grass. There was one animal we did not hunt, and that was the wolf. The wolf was considered a messenger from the Great Spirit, so we did not hunt the wolf. But when the pioneers and the settlers came here, they found them in many number, and to rid them of the wolves who killed their cattle and sheep, they offered a large bounty, $15 for a wolf skin. This was much money then. That of a doe would bring 50 cents, and a large buck, the skin of a large buck, would bring $1. You know, that is why you whites call $1 a buck. It was $1 for a buckskin. Yes. We lived at peace with the whites for many years after this, but we were careful. When we were near their cabin and they saw us, we would take our tomahawk from our sash. We would take it and strike it into a tree, and then we would hold our hand up to show we had no weapon. We came in peace. I do that to you today to show you I come as a friend and in peace. Now let me step out of the character of Captain Wolfe, and we'll continue our conversation on the Indians. All those things I told you about Captain Wolfe are all true. I found Captain Wolfe in the old records in Medina County. The first pioneers wrote about him. We had a man named Joe Harris, who was the first settler first it was called Harrisville, now it's called Lodi. And he befriended Captain Wolfe because they were right by Chippewa Lake. And in fact, Captain Wolfe, after the war, was seen often with his own son and then also with Joe Harrison's son in his canoe going through the lake and hunting and trapping. And a lot of the stories that Harris wrote down included Captain Wolfe. The last time we know of him being in that area was in 1822, so several years after the War of 1812 ended in 1815. So he was there till 1822. And what happened in that year was that the white settlers in the area, and there weren't that many even in 1822, but they decided that the Indians were, in the spring of the year, they were killing too many of the deer, especially the fawn. They liked eating the fawn. They were young and tender. And so they collected a group of settlers, took their flintlock guns, and they paid a visit to the 3 main Indian camps in the area, and one happened to be Captain Wolfe's. Well, when they came to Captain Wolfe's, there was no one in the village. He was out hunting with his men. So this was a hunting camp. They stripped bark off of a tree, and then they took charcoal from the fire, and they drew a picture of an Indian on it. And then they all took their flintlocks, and they shot holes in the picture. So when Captain Wolfe comes back with his hunters, of course, what do you think he thinks? He's going to be next. So he leaves, and about 6 months later in the record, I find that they're talking about Wolf Indians about 6 miles west of Lodi. Well, there's no tribe known as the Wolf Indians, but that was probably Captain Wolfe's clan, the Wolf clan of Delaware. And after that, we lose track of him. But we know the Delaware were one of the last tribes to leave Ohio. There was an act in 1830 that asked for removal of all the Indians. So by 1830 to probably about 1839, it was the last of the Indians and the last of the Delaware leave Ohio. And from here, they go to Kansas, Missouri, and they end up in Oklahoma territory on an Indian reservation, and that's where their reservation is today. So let me go through a couple things that I have here, and I'll take questions too. But let's first talk about the way I'm dressed. I'm dressed like an Indian would have been dressed back in the early 1800s or late 1700s. And probably the first thing you notice is my headdress. When you think of an Indian, you don't think of this type of headdress, though. You probably grew up watching the same programs I did, and they all had eagle feather bonnets, and they were they were Plains Indians. But in the woods, they wore a Gastoa. That's what this is. And so this is made up of all kinds of different feathers. They would go out and they'd get hawk and owl and eagle feathers. Then they'd go to the traders and they'd get feathers from birds that were not native to America. They'd get peacock feathers and pheasant feathers and put those in there. So this one has about 125 feathers in it. And they would wear these for ceremonial purposes. Of course, they wouldn't wear this out hunting or, in the woods. One thing I want you to take a look at, and I'll walk down here so you can see a little better, is my brow piece on this is a decoration. It's actually the same type of decoration I have on my knife sheath and also on my bag. I have leg ties with it, and my moccasins have it. Anybody want to guess what that is? Because this is the way the Indians decorated all their clothing before the white traders brought them beads. So does anybody know what it is? Yes, quill work. This is porcupine quills. And you probably won't see any of this unless you go to a museum, because not too many people do it anymore. I did my leg ties. I did not do my knife sheath. I had actually an Eastern Yankton Indian woman make this for me. But on my brow piece, this was original to the Gastoa. I got this from an Ottawa family. This is probably about 90 to 100 years old. Not the feathers, just the quill work. And you can see how it's really good yet. And if I take this off, you can see it's a really old deerskin cap. So they were at an Eastern Woodland Conference, educational conference that I went to at Fort Pitt in Pittsburgh, and they sold this to me, but it had no feathers on it. So then I went to the Smithsonian, and have any of you been to the American Indian Museum there? Very, very good. Very different than the rest of them, even in looks. But what most people don't know is there's a research center about 7 miles out of D.C. And so if you sign up for research and they give you a research assistant, you can go to the research center and they have 750,000 artifacts there. So when I knew I was going to do an Ottawa woodland Indian Gastoa, I called, and actually my congressman back then was Ralph Regula. He's passed away since, but he sat on the board of the American Smithsonian Museum, and he knew I did this, and he said, hey, anytime you want to research, let me know. So I did, and I went there, and I asked him to, I called him ahead of time, and I asked him to get some examples of Gastoas, and they said, well, we have 780. What tribe would you like? About what time period? So when I went there, they had 13 all laid out for me, and I could take pictures of them and everything, and that's how I rebuilt this one, just like one that I saw in the Smithsonian. It's a great research center. Then you go, and I spent a half a day there. You pull these drawers out. It's like a big library, and the drawers are like three stories high type of thing. You have to have a little tow motor to get up to the top, and you pull out the drawers, and the light comes on, and you just have just thousands of artifacts, anything you want to research. They loan these out to the other museums in the country, but that's where the research center is, where everybody goes to really do fine research. Can you hear me okay if I stand here? Or anybody need me to use the mic, or can you hear me? Okay. So, because I'll bring stuff around. So, of course, my cloth shirt, this would have been given, they would have gotten this from a trader. What did they make all their clothes of before the traders brought cloth? Skin, right. And so my leggings are deer skin. I make all this. So I shoot the deer, I make the leggings. My moccasins are made out of deer skin also. They're very soft. They're like bedroom slippers. But on the bottom, I just resoled them. That's why it's a thicker skin on the bottom. And I used buffalo for that, because that's tough. You know, when we used to resole our leather shoes, now you just throw them away, right? But the Indians would resole their mocks, and that's why they would decorate on the top. So I have some quill work on the decoration on the top. You notice I don't have a belt, I have a sash. Again, they would have gotten this from the traders. This is a chevron pattern from 1790, and it was done on an antique loom, just like the old ones. You notice I kept my tomahawk in the back. Sometimes they'd put a knife in there or a tomahawk. You'll also notice I have nose ring, earrings. They like jewelry. They would trade for that. They would make their own. Like I do have here a little gourd. That's a baby gourd. So they might make gourd earrings, things out of natural elements, but they liked the silver, and so they would go to the traders, and a good silversmith could do quite well as a trader with the Indians. This necklace has a cross on it. Now, one thing about this cross, this is the French cross, so it's double bar. But to the Indians, that didn't mean they were a Christian because they were wearing this. This is their symbol for a dragonfly. And a dragonfly was a messenger from the Great Spirit. So they would wear this because it was a messenger from the Great Spirit symbol. So just because they had one of these didn't mean that they were a Christianized Indian, although some were, like at Ganakhat and Schoenbrunn. Beads were made out of clay also. Most of the beads that were traded in America came from Europe and down in Italy and Eastern Europe, where they made them, they were ceramic and porcelain. Every Indian carried, and men and women, carried a neck knife like this, okay? So this is a steel one. They would have got the steel from the trader, and then I put that on a fox jaw. So this is my little camp knife. I use that in camp, cut my meat with it. The women also had this.
Foxjaw?
Yeah, just a fox jaw, yeah. Now before they had steel blades, they'd make knives like this. Now that's not made out of flint. They made their knives out of something else. Anybody want to guess?
Obsidian?
Yes, obsidian. Oh, you're a good group. You're getting all my questions right. Yes, obsidian. But now do we find obsidian in Ohio? No, it's out in the Rockies, out west. We know the Indians did this, I mean clear back to the ancient ones, the mound builders, because a lot of the mounds have obsidian knives in them. So we know they were trading clear out the waterways to the Rocky River. Clear out to the Rocky Mountains for obsidian. And this is very, very sharp. It's like glass. And that's why they like this for knives. It's interesting to know that some of our surgeons today are going back to using obsidian knives rather than steel because of the sharpness of them. And actually, Indians who perform surgery, they're healers, we would call them medicine men, but the ones that were good with surgery used the obsidian knives. So that's what they would make them for, out of, until they got the steel knives. Every Indian had a little pouch, I call it my man's purse, you know. So what do you think if I'm going out to hunt or something, what do I carry in this? Yeah, some flint, some steel, yeah, because you're going to have steel. Once they had flint and they had steel, they could make the sparks and start the fire. Before that, it was rubbing two sticks together. And I don't know how many scout leaders I got here, but I know with my scout troop, I never got anybody to start a fire with rubbing two sticks. Kept them busy for quite a while, but, you know, never got that far. Here, and I've got an example of that. Here's flint. And this is actually flint from Flint Ridge. Now this is where the Indians from a 5-state area went to get their flint. Has anybody been to Flint Ridge? Yeah, it's very, very interesting down there. You go down there and it's you can see like craters where they took the flint because it's right on the surface, and for centuries they've been doing this. The Indians would come there for flint because this flint, graded 1 to 10, and steel is 10, this is graded as an 8. It's the best, some of the best flint in the world. And so this is why they wanted to make their arrowheads out of flint. And yet you can nap it. you can chip it off and nap it down into this, which would have been like a spearhead maybe. And ultimately, you could, make them into arrowheads like this. And how many of you have arrowheads that you found as kids or your parents? Yeah. It's amazing how many arrowheads are found, or used to be found. When they tilled the ground in the old days, you were closer to it. Now you don't see them that much, but I used to get them when I was a kid. Now these two actually came from a house my grandfather built in 1912, and it is 1 block from the square in Medina. When he dug his foundation, he got a bag of arrowheads and a couple axe heads too. I've got like 4 or 5 of these, but these all came from my grandfather's property. In fact, I was born there. My mom was too. We had the house there. It was in our family for 100 years. We just sold it when when my mom died about 4 years ago. But I always like telling the kids that when I go to grade schools, because I went and I asked an archaeologist how old these arrowheads were, and he said between 2,000 and 4,000 years old. So I always liken it to, in Egypt, they're building pyramids when someone's napping that arrowhead in Medina, Ohio. So back to my flint and a striker. Darn. I just had it, and I don't see it now. Wow. That's really weird. No, it was in this. It was in this. I'll probably find it. I probably dropped it someplace. But okay, I can't show you. I was going to show you how quickly you can spark with a steel striker. You just take, and this is a napper. This is a antler. This is what they would nap their arrowheads with. But then you could just take steel striker and strike it like this, and you get sparks just like that. So that was much easier for the Indians to use than rubbing 2 sticks together. In fact, before they had the strikers, what they would do when they went to another campsite, a lot of times they would take like a buffalo horn, because the buffalo were very prevalent here. People don't realize that, but we had buffalo in Ohio. In fact, you read some of the old records. Daniel Boone, when he was down by Fort Washington, right by Cincinnati there, he stood one time behind an oak tree because they were having a migration of buffalo across the river into Ohio from Kentucky. And he stood behind this tree with his rifle, prodding them so they wouldn't run him over. And he did that for 3 hours while they passed. So we had a lot of buffalo here. Not like the millions they had out west, but I mean, there's a record of 1,600, So they would use the buffalo a lot. So they would use the horns to make different things, but for fires, they would get the coal, the hot coals, and take it to the next campsite and start their fire with that. Of course, when they got to steel, it was a lot easier. Some of the things they made out of that, you could cut that off and put a stopper in it at the bottom, and you have yourself cups made out of buffalo. You could also make ladles, little spoons. Another thing they would make out of buffalo, here's a rib. Now sometimes they'd make a dance stick out of this, but they would collect a group of these together, and then they would tie them with sinew. I think I might have some sinew here. Yeah, I don't think I make sinew, but this is the tendon on the backbone of the deer and the buffalo. And then there's others that are lighter, and you can split off and they actually come like sewing thread. That's what they used for sewing. Well, they would sew a number of these together, a row like this. There's 34 ribs in every buffalo, by the way. And they would sew a group of ribs together, and then they would glue it. They would make glue out of the hoofs of the buffalo and the deer, and they would melt that and put pine pitch with it, and that became a glue much like Elmer's glue. So they would glue it, sew it together, they'd make another row, and then they'd put a wood platform in the middle, and that became a sled in the winter for the kids. They really did use every part of the animal. They didn't waste a thing. Also hunting, they would spear, this is just the end of a spear, but they would spear their fish with something like this. And you can see they'd catch the body of the fish, and then it has small hooks like here and a spear here. This is the way they'd spear their fish in the rivers. Now, if you're a really great hunter, you might have one of these, and this is a bear claw. Now, these are grizzly bear claws. Did we have grizzly in Ohio? No. But they were so sought after and highly prized that woodland Indians, of course, they traded out to the Rocky Mountains. They'd send their hunters, and it would have been a brave hunter that came back with a grizzly claw necklace from killing a grizzly. And these are old Dutch trade beads. These are part of the bead industry. And these are actual old ones. They're about 300 years old. And people always ask me, where do you get beads like that? I just go to my rendezvous, just like the old guys do. There's traders. They put them out on a blanket, and you can buy a string of these. These are a little more expensive now, but most of the strings, like for 50 to 80 bucks, you can buy a string of old beads that are 200 to 300 years old. And the reason why is because we don't realize how many were traded here. I've got a record of another guy that I do a character of, John Holmes, who lived in Wadsworth, Ohio. He had a trading post there in 1811. And if you look at some of his records, one trip to Ontario and back, he was an English trader. They called him Indian Holmes because he married an Indian. And he brought back with him 100,000 beads in one trip. One trader. Then he had 600 ruffled shirts. He had 250 flintlocks. He had 600 knives and 400 tomahawks. So this is one trader. These traders were all over America like that. So it was amazing, the trade. And this is why all the foreign powers wanted this country, was for the fur trade, because they didn't have it anymore. You didn't go out and shoot deer there unless you were part of royalty and you had stocked lands. And if you happened to go on that land and shoot a deer, then you were usually hung for the transgression. So when they came to America, it was like Wonderland, you know. I mean, my gosh, there's game all over the place because the Indians only took what they needed. But with this big trade, that turned around real quick, and the buffalo is a good example. You know, at the beginning of about 1840-50, they estimate there were 60 million buffalo in the West. I mean, the herds there would come through, and the path would be 5 miles wide. And they'd come through, and it would take days for it to go by your village. By 1889, there's 600 left. That was the trade industry. So, just a couple other things here. So you ask someone over to your wigwam, or in the winter you live in a longhouse. So it's just like a cabin with logs, doors on either side. These could be really big, like 25, 30 feet wide, up to 160 feet long. House 20 families. You invite them over for dinner. You're going to have plates, cups, saucers. Well, yes and no. You're not going to have our china plates, although I have to say, the trade again, Tecumseh, for example, believe it or not, lived in more of a cabin than a longhouse, and he had been given and used a full set of china. So now when he went around to preach to all the tribes, go back to the old ways, he got rid of it. But up to then, he had a set of china. But what can you make, if you're an Indian, as utensils? Well, you're in the woods, so you can make things out of wood. There's out of a maple stump. I made that. That's just a bowl. Of course, you've got wood spoons you can make from that, like this. They raise corn, squash, beans, gourds. You can take a gourd and make a nice little bowl, real light. There's another gourd. You can paint them. You can take birch bark, wet it, form it, and then put a stick in it and take that sinew I said, sew it so it keeps its form, and you can make it out of birch bark. You also, now I didn't make this, I had a basket weaver make this, but here's a plate and it's made out of river grass. Simple river grass. Drinking, like a canteen, they'd take a gourd and use that for water. That's one thing, they were always very hospitable. If you went to have dinner or even to stop by, you come in a longhouse or a wigwam, the first thing they do is feed you. Before they ask questions, why are you here, or anything, they feed you, you get a place of honor. And for drink, they usually had, again, they didn't have many clay implements. So like for a bowl, they would use the stomach of a deer. And they would have that hung, dried out, but hung on a tripod, and they'd put fresh water in it. Then to give it a little flavor, they'd take mint leaves, put a little mint in it. And the inside of a longhouse or a wigwam, it was usually cool, so the water was cool just from being inside there. And you could refresh that way. So the first thing they did was feed you. Of course, in the winter, when they couldn't get fresh game, they always had their dried jerky, dried food, dried vegetables. They would put these in Parafletch leather bags and bury them in the ground. And then they would bring them back up and use them. They loved using pemmican, which was a combination of choke cherries and dried buffalo meat, jerky. And that they could stuff in the intestines of an animal and hang it and dry it. That would keep the military used that, the mountain men, the pioneers, because you could keep that for several years and then just put it in a pot with hot water, warm it up, soften it up, and that was very high in protein. And they'd use that a lot on their travels and also in the winter. Weaponry, I had my gun here. How many black powder hunters do I have? A couple, good. I'll tell you, I don't go to many grade schools anymore and have anybody know anything about this, guns at all, but especially the flintlocks. So, just to go through the demonstration here, so the way you load this and shoot this, you're going to have your powder in a powder horn like this. This happens to be a buffalo horn. And remind me to tell you about the buffalo horn one I brought with me, the other one. This keeps your powder dry. You're going to measure this out so it's the same amount of powder every time, because you put more powder in, it shoots further. So you've got like a tip of an antler or something that you're going to measure it in. But you're going to put powder in your barrel. You're going to piece of cloth, and then you're going to reach in your pouch. You're going to bring out a round lead ball. That lead ball is going to be not small enough that it just drops down. You're going to have to take your ramrod out of your gun, and you're going to have to push that all down to the bottom of the barrel, okay? So that's how you load the lead bullet. Now, how you shoot it, that's why it's called a flintlock. Here's your hammer, your cock it back, this is your piece of flint. That's going to strike this frizzle, which is steel. That's going to cause a spark. But before you do that, you got to take your powder and put a little more in the flash pan right there, because that's what's going to ignite, and there's a little hole in the barrel. It's going to shoot in there and shoot that bullet out. So that's how you shoot one of these, like that. And that would have been a big puff of smoke because it hit that gunpowder in the flash pan. Now, what do you think happens if you do that? You're all ready. You got your frizzle down. You go like this, and you've got a bear charging you. And you go like this, and nothing happens because the dampness got to your powder there. That's where we get the saying, a flash in the pan. Seriously. Flash in the pan. Didn't work. And now you're in trouble. Now you're in trouble. The next gun that came along in about 1840 was a percussion cap. Got rid of this flint, and it had a little cap with gunpowder in it, fit over a nipple that was there instead of the flash pan. That was the next advance of this gun. But for several hundred years, this was the gun. Now, How often, how many times can you load that and shoot that in a minute? 3, that very good guess. 2 to 3. If you're really good, you get 2 or 3 shots off in a minute. Now, if you have a bow and arrow and you got a quiver of arrows, you go like this. How many times can you do that in a minute? 25, 26. And a good bowman could keep 7 arrows in the air at the same time. So, you're an Indian, you're going to go to war, what are you going to take? Bow and arrow. But you know what? You're going to take a flintlock gun because it's going to shoot further than the bow and arrow. So, but when it gets closer, you're going to switch to your bow and arrow. I had my tomahawk. Thanks. This is British style, and the reason why it's British style, I'll show you a French. Little different shape. The main thing is the British style has a stem on it. There's a reason for that. This is also a pipe. You can put tobacco in here, and you can smoke it. So it's a weapon in war. It's a camp axe. It's a peace pipe. It's kind of like the Indian Swiss Army knife. You use it for everything. This is your French style. What did they use before they got the steel for the tomahawks? Wood clubs. And then they'd go to your local blacksmith and get a spike. And that would make a lethal weapon. This is a copy of one from Chief Logan, who's a Mingo chief, lived over near Steubenville area. He's famous for his last speech, Logan's speech, his lament, done under a big old oak tree that they took down about 70 years ago. But his club's in a museum, his war club. And Logan, see, the Senecas were part of the Iroquois Confederation. Cayuga, Mohawk, Seneca, let's see, who else? Cayuga and Oneida, yeah. And the Tuscaroras eventually, who came from North Carolina. During the Revolutionary War, the Seneca split, just like the Delaware. Some of them went with the Americans, and Iroquois were always loyal to the British. So they got thrown out of the village, this group that went with the Americans, and they were called Mingos, which means dogs. And they came to Ohio. And so we have a lot of Mingo villages here. And he was chief of the Mingo village. Actually, he came to a village just down the road from where I live. And the reason why I know about him, why we know about him, is because Thomas Jefferson wrote about him in a book and talked about his lament. He was friends with the Americans until they came and massacred his family when he was away hunting. And he came back and for 10 years declared war on all whites. And with a war club just like this, he killed over 110 men in hand-to-hand combat. Then he came and he put down his war club and said, I'll fight no more. Who's there left to mourn for Logan? No bloodline of mine lives. And so he ends his warrior days, and he never fights again. But Thomas Jefferson wrote about that, and that's why people know about Chief Logan. You had a lot of different Indian tribes here. They just kept coming through because of the trade routes. Ottawa, Seneca, Miami, Shawnee, a lot of different ones. Yes?
You said to remind you to tell us about the buffalo horn.
Oh, the buffalo horn, thanks. See, I'm glad someone remembered. So you can come up and check this one out later. It's hard to see from here. But this buffalo horn is an exact replica of one that is in the History Museum at Fort Pitt. And this has carvings on it. They're scrimshawed, and it's the year of 1757. And I went and I saw the original one this for me, and I mean, it looks exactly like that one. And it's got a picture of the rivers in Pittsburgh, and it has a picture of the fort. And why you can't see it, it's on buffalo, and it's got red ink dye on it. You usually see white cow horns with black scrimshaw on them. But this is just unusual. And the other thing that makes this unusual is we only know of 3 buffalo horns that are left in the world. One's at Pittsburgh, the other one belongs to a private collector up in Toledo, and the third one is in a museum in Russia. And we know the Indians use these a lot, but they used them and threw them away. You know, I mean, they didn't scrimshaw a lot of them. This one obviously was probably done for an officer in the dates 1757 during the French and Indian War at Fort Pitt, after they took it from the French. But you can take a look at that later. Here's another hunting bag, a little bit bigger than the one I have here. This is like for a daily, and then if I want to carry more things, I'd put it in this. And here again, you've got your quill work. So what did the Indians use for, oh, one thing. Another thing, they used all parts of the animal. This I usually put my flute in, but that's made out of a buffalo bladder. And again, just quill work on it, but it comes with a little bag. So they would use that, use every part of the animal. Now, if you're a child, you learn to start using birch bark. You make yourself little canoes, float them down the river. If you're a girl, you start making dolls out of corn husks. And then you learn to dress them and sew. If you're a boy, you're starting to shoot bow and arrow when you're 4 years old. And so you get very good at it very quickly, and you're given a willow hoop like this, and they roll it on the ground, and 20 feet away you're supposed to shoot your arrow through it. The other thing the kids had, since they didn't have TV and all those things, they made themselves toys, and these are bull roars, wood out of buffalo. You would carve them up and then you'd twirl them like this. Yep, got to have my string tight on this. Put this one down. But the kids would get together and they'd carve these out, and then they'd compare them. I don't know if you had 20, 30 kids doing this, it might get annoying, wouldn't it? What was the big game they played, sports game? Yes, lacrosse. So here's a kid's lacrosse. I have a bigger one, I didn't bring it with me. The string was often used, they used tendons from bobcat or mountain lion, catgut. And then here's their leather ball. So the idea was, can't touch it, use your stick, and you throw it through, toss it through a hoop on a 20-foot pole as a goal at the end. And that's about the only rule. I mean, the Indians would go out and you could take your stick and club the other guy, you know. There were men who not only had broken bones, but some people died on the field. This is a way to show your manhood and not go to war. So tribes would, you know, compete. It was like Ohio State and Michigan, you know. But they would bet on these games too. And in fact, Ohio was the bet one year. This was after the Beaver Wars. The Beaver Wars were 1648 to 54. The Beaver Wars happened because the Iroquois sided with the British. They had already trapped out their beaver, and they looked to the north side of Lake Erie where the Huron were. And they had a lot of beaver. So they went to the British and got guns. They went across, started a war with the Huron, and within a year, they had wiped out 20,000 Huron. Two groups escaped. One went to Green Bay and became the Green Bay Packers. Just seeing if you're paying attention. No, they go to Green Bay. They come back in the 1700, about 1740. They come right here to the islands, and they're known as the Wyandots. That's the British name for Hurons. The other group went around the lake and came to the south side where the Erie Indians were. There were about 10,000 Erie at that time. And they get befriended. Well, the Iroquois said, we don't like that. We're going to make war on the Erie once we get done with the Huron. So then they had second thoughts, because the Erie, and I don't know if you have any Erie forts around here. I have one just up the street from where I live, and the remnants of one. The Erie built forts. They put timber in the ground just like we had forts, but they kept them separated just enough to shoot bow and arrow out. But it was still a protective fort that the village would come to if attacked. They were usually around high promontory hills or cliffs. So they were fierce warriors. So the Iroquois said, well, maybe we shouldn't fight them. So let's have a tournament with lacrosse. And the winner takes Ohio. So the Erie accept the challenge, and they take all their best warriors and families up to western New York, around the Finger Lakes, and they meet them for a multiple-day lacrosse tournament. The second day of the game, the Iroquois run off the field, drop their sticks, run off the field into the woods where their women bring out their tomahawk and spears and bows and arrows. They turn around and they slaughter all the Erie cream of the crop warriors and their families. Then they come through Ohio and they wipe out the Erie. There's no Erie blood left today. They get down to Cincinnati area, the Great Miami River, and the Miami tribe stops them. And then they go back to New York, and Ohio for 100 years is a no man's land. Everybody comes here to hunt, temporarily set up villages, but no one claims it. And this is one reason why when the pioneers come, this is a great hunting area. There's pockets of Indians, yes, but no one claims it as a tribe. And that's why when they go to try to treaty this land, nobody owns it. So they're paying this tribe off, but this tribe also lives there, and that's why they got into a big mess with the Indians about that. So one more thing. Music. What they use for music? Drums, right. And not the same type as our rock and roll bands do, but this is one I made. This is got the sinew tied on deer skin in a wood hoop. I made it one-sided so you can see. And the more you wet this and tie it tighter, the higher the pitch. So this one sounds like this. Anybody gone to an Indian powwow? Yeah. Native American? So you'll see big drums there, ceremonial drums. I have one that's like 3 feet wide. 4 or 5 men will drum it. You'll notice that they often have like 2 beats, a loud one and followed by a soft one. There's a reason for that. The drum represents the heartbeat of the nation, the Indian nation. So it's like your heart. There's a loud beat and a soft beat, followed by a soft beat. So that's why they have the drum. That's what represents, the drum represents. What else did they have? Singing, yeah. How about flutes? Yes. Here's my flute. This is just a simple flute. I have a couple different flutes, but this one is just made out of river cane. And by the way, this bag is the buffalo scrotum. Before school ended, I did a 4th grade class, and some 4th grader asked me, "What's a scrotum?" I said, "I don't want to get into the X-rated thing here," so I just said, "You'll have to ask your parents." But anyway, so the first thing they would do is the kids would learn how to make whistles from river cane that grew by all the rivers. And the boys would learn how to imitate birds to bring them in to shoot bow and arrow. Then a little bit older, you make yourself a flute. Simple piece of cane, 4 or 5 holes. Pretty nice for a river cane flute. Now all the men would have a courting flute, and they have a courting song, and they go to court their girl, the one they were interested in. They'd go to the lodge, do this in the evening. She would hear the song. Every boy had a different song. She'd know who was out there. Then she had to ask her parents for permission to go out and meet with him. When she does and gets permission, The parents go out and watch. This is what starts the role of the robe. The marriage robe later, but the courting robe. And they take a robe and they put it around them so they're a little private. They can talk while mom and dad stand over there and watch. A little different than today, right? The other thing they had were rattles. Here's a wood rattle. Here's one made out of a buffalo bladder. Here's an old style. What's that made out of? No? Deer hoofs and a deer leg bone. That came from the deer I shot for my leggings, actually. And here's one. Deer hoofs again. Then they put a bell on it from a trader. Anybody want to guess what part of the buffalo that is? That is his privates. That's his penis. I don't tell that to the fourth graders. So here's another one. This is a snapping turtle I got on my pond. I don't like snappers in my lake. Now, if you had one that was decorated similar to this, and you had one of these, you would have been, white men would have called him a medicine man. These were healers. This is a typical one of the Iroquois. It was known as the False Face Society. You would be a healer. You would carve this out of a tree that was usually struck by lightning, because that showed that God or the Creator had touched the tree. And then you would wear this. Someone was sick. You'd wear this. You would sing a healing chant. You'd have your rattle, drum. But the main thing is you would give them herbs or natural plants to heal them. And it's interesting to note about 350 of our prescriptions today are old Indian remedies. When the first pioneers came, they sought out the Indian healers before they went to a white doctor, because the Indian healers really knew what they were doing. The problem was that most of the Indians died in this country basically from smallpox, TB, diseases that they couldn't stop, syphilis. They had no immune system to it, and it would come in and they would wipe out 3/4 of a tribe in 1 year. So they would lose their healers. They would lose their historians because nothing was written down. One more thing, and then that's all I have to show you. What is that? What animal? Bobcat. This is a talking stick. And it doesn't talk, but what they would do with a talking stick, they'd bring it to their council. And the council sat in a circle. All men were equal. Chief sat in a circle. By the way, there was a peace chief in many tribes. There was a war chief. The war chief was elected. You picked a war chief by the one, not the bravest warrior, but he was brave. The main thing was he was a leader, and he could accomplish a mission and get everybody back safe. That's the leader you wanted to be a war chief. Tecumseh was a great war chief like that. So the war chief was elected. The peace chief was usually a little older, a little wiser, but all sat in a circle. And when you talked of something, the idea was to get consensus, and everybody could speak. So to keep control of the meeting, you passed the talking stick around. It went right to left, and then left to right. The 2 times you had it, you could speak as long as you wanted on the topic being discussed. This created great orators. The Indians were great speakers, and it gave everybody a chance to speak. And if you talked out of turn, didn't have the talking stick in your hand, you left council. Let's maybe sit in a few to Congress. What do you think? I show this to my commissioners every once in a while, you know. You guys need a talking stick. But it worked. It was a very simple thing. But when the whites first came and tried to, again, do treaties, they were very frustrated with the Indians because the Indians wanted to make consensus with their tribe. So they would take days, weeks to discuss this, and they wanted it done quick. But everybody got to say, and a lot of times they couldn't reach a consensus. So what happened? They just go back to their village, you know. They just didn't make a decision, and the whites just couldn't understand that. So, but that's what they tried to do. It wasn't democracy 50% plus one. It was literally team building, consensus building is what they tried to do. Questions?
Yes.
Yes.
The white skin, the white fur.
Oh, the white fur here, and also on the back here, this is a little brown and white. These are ermine skins, so weasel. And the Indians liked using these because, especially out west, you'll see a lot of the Plains Indians, and I have a Plains Indian lecture on Custer's Last Stand, and I've got a shirt with 40 of these on. They liked using the ermine because they wanted to be like the ermine. The ermine was, even though they were small, they have a little sharp teeth, and they're very brave. I mean, if a bear comes by their den, they'll go out and nip at the bear. They're also hard to see because in the summer they get a little more brown, and therefore they're camouflaged. They're hard to catch and kill. So they would wear these on their clothing. Any other questions? Yes?
You mentioned your character, Captain Wolf.
Mm-hmm.
Did he ever mention about the plagues that the white man inflicted on him? Did he ever say anything?
Not that I know of, no. He asked, did Captain Wolfe ever complain about the plagues and the things that happened to the Indians? And none of the, but remember, the record was written by a white guy. Yeah. So, you know, I don't know if he conversed it or not. We just don't know. We just don't know.
Would you suggest, if you want to read about the Iroquois wars that you talked about with the Erie and other tribes?
Well, I'll tell you, if you really want to know about early American pioneer history, and it also includes the Indians, but that's what we're talking about is the woodland Indians that were here. They're the historic Indians. I mean, the mound builders and everything are way before, and the Indians didn't even know. They couldn't tell you about the mound builders. They just knew there was an ancient tribe. In fact, there was a guy I wrote about, when he built his cabin, has in the records that they built it on a burial mound. They didn't know it at the time. It was right where an elementary school is now. But they ran into these huge skeletons that were 8 and 9 feet long. And you hear this all the time. So this guy up here talked about the legend of a dark race of people with beards, and they were giants, and they were here before the Indians. I just find that kind of fascinating, you know. I forget where I was going with that. Oh, author, yeah, okay. So we're talking about the historic Indians 400 years ago. The rest of them we don't know a lot about. Even the Indians don't know about them. So if you want a set of books that's really good, I think, is Alan Ecker. Frontiersman, Wilderness Empire. He's got like 5. Those are excellent books because he researched them very well, and they give you the pioneers, Simon Keaton, all those guys, plus the Indian side, because he goes into Simon Girty, and I think those are some of the best books. But if any of you are interested in books, you can email me. I've got literature up here just on my website. I do I got about 14 characters that I do. I do these about every week, and it's all word of mouth, but get this has a website, and you can email me there, and I can give you books if you're interested in a certain type or a tribe. My own personal library, I have about 850 Native American books that I've collected over the years. So, yes?
Enjoy doing
You mentioned the trader that brought hundreds of this and thousands of that, and large quantities of goods. How did they transport them?
How'd they transport them? Horseback. Horseback and saddle packs, if they could get a wagon, but in the first part, there were no roads, so they couldn't do wagons. That's why the rivers were so important. You could put a lot in like a French bateau, 46 feet long and 15 feet wide. You could move a lot of stuff, even in a canoe. So the canoes and the boats were used more than anything. But if you had to go overland from there, it was usually pack animals. Yes?
John, you need to mention the voyageurs and the 3-ton canoes that came from Montreal to Grand Portage. That carried a lot of trade goods.
It did. It
And
did.
furs back to Europe.
Yep. Yep. Anything else? Yes?
Obviously, being hired was a rough and tumble business. Have any idea what they carried with them as far as first aid kit?
Well, I can tell you the Indians, one thing that they usually carried right in their pouch was a blood root. Blood root, when mixed and put on a wound, helped coagulate the blood. And even the pioneers figured it out, the pioneer doctors, when they first came. So I didn't bring mine, but I do have a piece of blood root at home. It's kind of orangish black. And so they would have things like that they would take with them, that they knew if they were going to go to battle, they'd take blood root for one thing. You also went to the doctor. It was a specialist field, just like we do now. I mean, certain doctors could heal certain things. There wasn't general practitioners. You went to a specialist. And another thing interesting about that is you paid the doctor. No free health care in the Indian village. But it was all relative, and by that I mean the doctor comes, the healer comes, and he performs this operation or this healing or medicine to a woman who's a widow who doesn't have much. Maybe her payment is a morsel of food from her dinner that night. He does the same treatment for the chief who has a herd of 40 horses. Maybe it's 2 horses. So it was relative. But everybody paid the doctor, and there was a good reason for that. He had to pay a retiring healer for the knowledge. He paid for that knowledge. So it was a reciprocal type agreement. Anything else? Yes?
One more. Indians raising youngsters. How, in comparison to the white, how successful they were in raising their youngsters?
Yes, how successful the Indians were raising their young children. Well, I can tell you this. The family unit was all important in the Indian village. And the woman is working all the time. I mean, she's tending to the crops. She's taking all the skins the man brings home and making clothing from it and tanning it and then getting dinner ready, you know. I mean, she's busy totally. The man, he's hunting, he's practicing his bow and arrow, he's defending the tribe. The kids are out even though chasing the crows away from the crops and the deer, and they're learning skills. But who's tending the children more than the parents? The grandparents. The grandparents are in the family unit, in the lodge. They are really training the kids more than anything else. And the elders are really respected in the Indian family because of their knowledge. Yes, they can't do the work that they used to do, but that's why they're there to train the kids. That was pretty normal, all across the country and all tribes. Anything? Yes?
What's an average lifespan then for a West Indian?
Interesting. What's the average lifespan of the Indian? It was, on the average, longer than the whites. Back then, you were lucky if you reached the pioneers, 40 years old. The Indians, there's records all the time of them being in their 60s and 70s, and they're still warriors, And of course, there's those ones that are 100 and that, but no, on the average, they probably lived longer because they were healthier. They every day, it wasn't an easy life, but they were active every day, and they lived most of the time on the average longer than the whites. They also didn't have the diseases until the whites brought them. I mean, it was pretty, they couldn't believe, the Europeans couldn't believe that there were no diseases over here when they first came. The missionaries write about that a lot. Anything else?
Do you have any
Yes.
Indian in you?
Oh, she asked, do I have any Native American in me? I have that question all the time. No, I am 100% German both sides. My great-great-great-grandfather on my mom's side was named Geyer, and he came over from Germany in 1823 and went to Valley City, which is just a few miles from Medina. And then it was my great-great-grandfather with 4 of his brothers moved to Medina. So everybody's buried in the same Zion Lutheran cemetery, and I'm the organist there, so. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much for having me. Yeah, sure.
Everybody would like